Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about the value of a statistical life. The value of a statistical life isn't about the value of an individual person's life. It's not based on your value, my value, any individual's value. Instead, it's about the value of risks to life across a population. It's called a statistical life because we don't know who in the population is losing their life as a result of a particular policy. Broadly speaking, there are three ways you can go about trying to value human lives, value statistical lives. One is the productivity approach that asks, well, how productive are people in the society? What's going to be the future value of their earnings, and discount that back to get the present value? That's called the human capital approach. Another way to do it is through looking at people's willingness to pay. How much do they pay to try to protect their lives? And another way to do it is looking at their willingness to accept risks to the loss of life, risks of death. So let's talk a little bit about each of those methods. The productivity method values a person's life, or a statistical life, based on the present value of future earnings. It weighs up the lifetime stream of earnings a person has ahead of them, discounts it back to get a present value using a discount rate to convert future income into present value of that income. And that's the basis on which people's lives get valued. There are a couple problems with this approach. They include the following: that earnings are affected by all sorts of things. They're not just affected really by how productive a person is or how valuable a person is to society, let alone to themselves and their family. They're also affected by things like what's the rate of unemployment? Is the labor force unionized or not? Is there discrimination on the basis of gender? Women get paid less than men for the same work, or on the basis of race or ethnicity. That's one of the problems. Another problem is that non-workers, people who don't work because they're ill or disabled or unemployed or too young or too old, right? They get valued at zero. They don't have any earnings. Now, I suppose if you're too young, you'd have future earnings once you get employed, so you can count that. But old people, forget about it. Their future earnings are zero. So the productivity approach leads to the kind of conclusion that some people might find objectionable, that, well, societies in which people are productive, more productive, where there's higher earnings, or locations where they're more productive, those people are more valuable and we ought to do more to protect their lives than other people. Some folks might think there's something wrong with that basis for making these kinds of decisions about the value we should put on a statistical life. Second method is willingness to pay. Here you look at the value of life by looking at how much people spend, for example, on medical treatments, insurance expenditures, etc. And this willingness to pay has some problems associated with it as well. First, of course, is everywhere willingness to pay is constrained by ability to pay. So those who have more money generally have more willingness to pay. Maybe that someone without much money values their life, the welfare of their kids, just as much as somebody with a lot of money, but they can't spend as much on insurance or doctors. Willingness to pay puts greater weight on the lives of relatively well-off folks. And another problem, of course, is that the amount that people pay depends on the way societies structure things like the provision of health care and the provision of insurance. In some societies, people don't have to pay, or don't have to pay as much for those things as in other places. A third way to come up with a value of a statistical life is to look at, well, let's see how much people are willing to accept, how much you have to pay them in order to risk their lives. And the way economists do this, and this is a pretty widespread way to come up with these numbers, these values of statistical lives, is by looking at what are called compensating wage differentials for riskier jobs. So you compare two jobs that are pretty similar. Say you've got a coal miner and a copper miner, and the coal miner runs an extra risk that the copper miner doesn't run, which is the risk of getting sick and dying from coal dust, from black lung disease. And so you want to say, well, what's the value of a statistical life? You say, well, how much extra do we have to pay the coal miners to run that risk? And we'll infer from how much extra they get paid and how big the risk is, what the value is that they themselves are placing on their lives. This approach has some problems as well. First, people may not always have accurate information about the risks they're running in different occupations. Second, it may be that people who take riskier jobs like being, parachuters, for example, into forest fires. Those folks risk their lives. How much extra do they have to get paid? Maybe they get paid some extra for doing it, but they also may be folks who have less risk aversion than other folks. And to infer from how much you have to pay those who are less risk averse to take a risk to how much a life is worth in the society is a bit of a leap. Another problem is that voluntary risks that people enter into because they want to take those risks may be kind of different from involuntary risks that are imposed on them. People take risks all the time. People do risky things. They play risky sports, but they're the ones who make the choices about taking those risks. And they may say, hey, that's not a great basis for you to tell me how much my life is worth when we're talking about involuntary risks, like the risk that I or my kids are going to get cancer because of some chemicals being emitted into my water or into my air by polluters. Maybe that those risks aren't the same. They're not commensurable. And finally, the choices to accept risks may reflect desperation rather than free choice. Sometimes people take really risky employment, risky jobs, do risky things for money, not because, hey, I've weighed it up and this is what my life is worth and I'm willing to risk it to get this extra gain or whatever, but because they really don't have much choice. They're desperate. And to infer from that desperation what their lives are worth seems to be, again, pretty problematic. What all these methods have in common, when you think about it, the productivity approach, the willingness to pay approach, the willingness to accept approach, what they've all got in common is that poor people, their lives won't appear to be worth as much as richer people. And in poor societies, the value of a statistical life won't be as high as in a richer society. So let's translate these into the kind of diagrams that you see in economics textbooks. So if we look at two different countries, one with higher income and one with lower income, what's going to happen to the acceptable level of pollution, let's say, or anything that poses risks to human lives? Well, in the poorer country, the benefits of reducing pollution are going to look smaller because those folks have a lower value of a statistical life. So the policy recommendation that follows from that approach is to say, in those poorer countries, it's okay to have less pollution reduction, more pollution, weaker environmental policies, because their lives, they aren't worth as much. It's not worth investing as much to save them. That's how purchasing power enters into the picture. What if we think about political power as well? Political power through which costs and benefits are refracted in the social decision-making process. In a situation like that, if the people whose lives are at risk don't have that much power, the benefits of reducing threats to their lives are going to be muted. They're going to be diminished in the decision-making process. And so we're going to get the power-weighted benefits of saving lives pushed down and the actual level of pollution reduction, the actual level of environmental protection reduced. And if we put both of these things together, we're going to get not only lower valuation on lives because people have lower purchasing power in poor countries, but also, in practice, less valuation because they have less political power to make the value of their lives count in social decision. And we're going to end up with even more pollution in the poor countries, even greater risks to human life as a result of lack of environmental protection. Now that all may sound kind of abstract, so let me translate it into one example. Let's say we're asking the question, where's the efficient place to dispose of hazardous trash, of various kinds of hazardous waste? And let's say we're going to base that just on cost-benefit analysis. We're going to ignore political power here. We're just going to base it on purchasing power and the value of a statistical life as calculated by neoclassical economists. Where should we dump the trash? Well, here's a prescription. Let me read it for you. The measurement of the cost of health-impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. From this point of view, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic of dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. That quote was taken from an internal World Bank memorandum back in the 1990s, written by the chief economist of the World Bank, an economist named Larry Summers. And Summers later said that he actually meant this to provoke discussion. He was just trying to be provocative here. And he was provocative. This provoked a lot of discussion. And I think he actually ought to be congratulated for provoking that discussion, because what he was saying here, though it may sound outrageous to some folks, that's exactly the way that neoclassical economics recommends valuing statistical lives. All he was doing was putting it on the table in language that ordinary people could understand. What happens in the real world? Partly as a result of the prescriptions based on the value of a statistical life, and partly as a result of the exercise of political power, which pushes even more hazards onto those with less power, political as well as purchasing power. In the real world, what we see is a lot of waste being moved from relatively rich countries to relatively poor countries, and within the latter, within those relatively poor countries, being dumped in relatively poor communities, communities that don't have much power to resist having the world's waste dumped on them. Thanks very much.